First, I would like to thank the conference organizers for including our paper into the program. This paper is co-authored with Lei Li at Federal Reserve Board and also Tao Shu at CUHK Shenzhen. Our paper is motivated by a general trend that has observed in the past few decades. That is, the US have witnessed sharply rising income inequality, much more than other developed countries. Okay. Should I? Oh. Later. Okay. Okay. So this has caught like a tremendous attention from the public, including like professionals, regulators, and the media. And in fact, a QJE paper by Song et al. 2019 argued that 1/3 of such US income inequality escalation can be attributed to rising within firm inequality. This type of rising income inequality has also aroused some attention to social fairness or unfairness in income and pay practices for the corporations. In fact, article in Forbes in 2018 says that if you have any doubt about our country's disappearing middle class, check out the current CEO to employee pay gap. Okay? So partially out of this public concern over this pay inequality in the economy, in August 2015, the SEC required US publicly traded companies to disclose their CEO to median employee pay ratios on an annual basis. And I believe a similar regulation was also passed in UK around similar time. Okay. Of course, this regulation also met some pushback, both from the firms and also from some of the legislators, because some people say that this is a very costly regulation, and also it may not achieve the effect it really it aims to cure. Okay. So we think that this is an important phenomenon to look at, but so far there has been a lack of studies in the literature to especially using the US data to examine this within firm pay inequality. And one reason is the lack of granular US data on employee pay records. So the existing literature either rely on those voluntarily reported wages from either CompuStat, but only like less than 20% of the CompuStat firms report employee wages, or they use like Glassdoor data. But also Glassdoor data mostly like self-reported by the young employees of a company, or they rely on some international data. For example, this Mueller et al. Paper used UK data to look at this within firm pay inequality, or some studies just rely on executive pay records only. Okay, so in this paper, we try to study this workplace pay inequality in the US and extend the literature in two important ways. First, we would exploit an individual level data set of employee pay records from the US Census Bureau. And specifically, we will use the longitudinal employer household dynamics, the LEHD database, to accurately measure like within firm pay inequality for the US companies. And second, we examine the differential percentage growth in pay between executives and rank and file employees. So what we call a pay growth gap. Previous studies that look at within firm pay inequality exclusively focus on the difference in pay levels between the executives and the employees, and what we call pay level gap. And they predominantly rationalize such inequality in the optimal contracting framework. And that's very understandable, because if you think about the pay level of the executives versus the employees, they have different job titles, job nature, and more importantly, the executives may possess different, like higher or better talents, or they create more value to the firms. So it's easy to understand, but things are a little bit more unclear if you look at the percentage pay growth between from one year to the next. Okay, so we argue that pay growth gap compared to the pay level gap is less affected by the talent differential between executives and employees. And also, we also think that pay growth gap itself is an important dimension of inequality that people care about. So people do not necessarily just care about the gap in their pay level, because if they think that this pay level gap is due to the different job nature or the talent differentials, sometimes they will also think more about in terms of the pay growth. Okay? And in fact, the news media also starts to pay attention to the CEO pay growth, percentage pay growth. For example, a 2019 Wall Street Journal article finds that for big companies, they pay their CEOs, they increase their CEO pay like percentage points, in percentage points, both for good and bad performance. So whether this practice is fair or not, it really depends on the people's judgment. Okay? And finally, pay growth gap also helps shape the evolution of the pay inequality over time. Okay? So in terms of data, our executive annual compensation data comes from the S&P's Capital IQ database. We do not use executive comp because it only covers S&P 1500 companies. And also, there has some literature showing some backfilling bias in the executive comp database. Okay? Our individual employees' wage and personal characteristics comes from the US Census Bureau, and specifically, it comes from the LEHD program that combines the unemployment insurance earnings records from the state-level UI offices. So in that data, we have the quarterly earnings for each employee-employer pair and individual employees' personal characteristics, such as their gender, age, race, and education. Our LEHD sample, we do not have like the LEHD sample for all the 50 states in the US. We are only allowed to access data from like 26 states. But our data includes like California, Texas, Florida, Illinois, Pennsylvania. So New York is probably the only missing major state in our sample. And we also want to make sure that a firm, like the majority of our firm's workforce is in the 26 states we have. So we will exclude a firm year if our LEHD data covers less than 90% of our firm's workforce. So our final sample consists of about like 4,500 firm years between 1999 and 2008. Okay, so for each firm year, we will create two variables. One is the pay growth for the executives. So that's the average percentage increase in pay for the executives. And we also create a similar like pay growth variable for the rank and file employees. And for such calculations, we will require each executive and employee to stay in the firm at both years when we calculate the percentage pay growth. So it really doesn't matter like whether you take the average executive and calculate the percentage pay growth for the average executive, or we calculate the percentage pay growth for each individual person in our data set and then take the average or the median. The results are all the same. Okay? And we first find that there is a big like pay growth gap between executives and rank and file employees. So executives, despite their higher salary to start with, they also enjoy a much higher pay growth. So the average executive pay growth is about 16.8%, but the average employee pay growth is only 5.2%. So this leads to a large pay growth gap of 11.6% per year. And we also find that 1/3 of the firms in our sample have pay growth gaps above 20%, and also around 10% of the firms actually have pay growth gaps above 50%. So that's a very huge pay growth gap. Okay? And this slide just shows you that the pay growth gap also tends to vary with economic situations in the economy, because it seems that the percentage pay growth for the CEOs and executives tend to fluctuate more with the economic condition. But for rank and file employees, their pay growth does not vary that much. Okay, so one thing I want to tell you is this large pay growth gap itself, per se, does not necessarily indicate any like unfairness or anything, any cause for concern, because executives relative to the rank and file employees may simply receive higher pay growth for a greater increase in their either in their level of talent or the value of their talent over time relative to the employees. And this, in turn, leads to a greater increase in the marginal contributions of the executives to the firms relative to the employees between 2 years. So if this is the case, then the pay growth gap should increase in firm performance. Okay? Like when the shareholder wealth increases, we should expect to see a larger pay growth gap. Okay? So next, we just follow the literature to decompose a firm's performance, stock returns, into two components. One is an idiosyncratic component, and the literature calls it like a skill part of the stock return. And another part is a systematic return, and the literature sometimes call it a luck return or luck performance for the firm. And we find that the pay growth gap, so this slide shows you some regressions. So basically for each firm year, we create two variables. Okay? One is the pay growth for the executives, the other is the pay growth for the employees. And then we regress the pay growth on a dummy to indicate whether this is executive or employee, and then we interact this dummy variable with the firm performance measures. So total return is the total like stock performance in a year, and idiosyncratic return and systematic return are just the two components of the stock performance. So, and in our regressions, we control for firm times year fixed effects. So it sort of controls for a lot of the time varying firm characteristics or industry characteristics of the same firm. And what we find is the pay growth gap increases in firm performance, whether you look at like the total like stock performance or the idiosyncratic or the systematic component. Okay, so all the coefficients are positive and significant. Okay, so our first finding here just says that this pay growth gap increases in firms' idiosyncratic stock performance, which is largely attributable to labor input, especially the executive talent or effort. So this seems to be consistent with the pay performance alignment and optimal contracting. A little bit surprising finding is that this pay growth gap also increases in firms' systematic firm performance, or the luck return. So if you believe that this systematic component or this luck stock return is largely beyond the control of the executives, then it seems a little bit surprising that why the executives still enjoy higher pay growth relative to the employees for that. However, some recent theoretical models, okay, especially the theoretical model by Gabex and Landier 2008, they can explain this result because in their model, their like comparative sorting model, the pay of CEOs due to their scalable talent is an increasing function of firm size. So in that model, firm size is just market cap. So that's, however, the pay of lower ranked employees does not change with firm size. So that's why when you look at the stock return, like the percentage change in firm size over time, then you will find a larger increase in pay growth for the executives, like CEOs, relative to the employees. So their model can be explain this result. However, we continue to find another interesting pattern that we think is hard to be reconciled by the models, even by the Landier model, is we find an asymmetry in pay growth gap across different deciles of firm performance. So this graph shows you how the pay growth gap changes when you look at the 10 deciles based on the firm's total stock returns. And we basically find like a convex relation. When the firm's performance is relatively worse, you don't see any change in the pay growth gap between the two types of workers. But when firm performance starts to get better, the executive seems to enjoy higher pay growth relative to the rank and file employees. And this slide basically just formalizes the previous slide's result using a regression setting. We decompose a firm's stock return into a high and a low component. And and we interact that with the dummy for executives, and we find a symmetry in pay growth gap for good performance relative to the bad performance. And more interestingly, we find this asymmetric pattern only exists for the idiosyncratic part of the stock performance, not the systematic part. Okay? So the first column shows you that there is statistically different, like in the pay growth gap for good versus bad performance. The second column shows that for the systematic performance, you don't see obvious asymmetry. So, yeah, let me repeat. Like, we find a symmetric relation between pay growth gap and firm performance. And more interestingly, we find this asymmetry exists only for idiosyncratic returns, but not for systematic returns. So, in terms of economic magnitude, we find that when performance is good, a 1 standard deviation increase in idiosyncratic returns is associated with an increase of 5.6% in pay growth gaps. But when performance is bad, a 1 standard deviation decrease in idiosyncratic returns is only associated with a decrease of only 0.3% in pay growth gaps. Okay? And we find a very similar and even stronger asymmetric return if we examine only the cash pay of the executives. So if you worry about like our results are driven by stock options or stocks, etc., we actually find stronger results if we use the cash. So we perform a bunch of like robustness tests, and we find this asymmetry in pay growth gaps actually holds in various robustness settings, like how we compose the stock returns in different ways, or we look at accounting-based performance like ROA or sales growth rather than stock returns, or use different model specifications, etc. Or we also match the employees to the executives by their gender, male, race, and education, because you may worry that the executives have different demographic characteristics from the executives. But even based on that match sample, we find similar result, or if you change the regression design. Okay, yeah, so this basically shows that the asymmetry still persists for like sales growth or ROA as performance measures. So our study reveals a convex relation between firms' compensation practices and idiosyncratic stock performance. We think this pattern is even new for the CEO executive pay literature because previous studies on the pay asymmetry in that literature find either a concave relation or they debate about the existence of pay asymmetry in the luck component. So there is some debate on whether there is a asymmetric pay for luck for the CEO compensation. Okay? But theoretically, our finding of an asymmetry in pay growth gaps cannot be easily explained by optimal contract design because the Gaybax and Ladian model, they do not predict asymmetry. And also some of the classic models in implicit contract theories, they cannot explain why the asymmetry only manifests in the idiosyncratic performance but not systematic performance. Okay. So on the other hand, we think that maybe managerial power and rent extraction can be a possible explanation because if the executives do not have the unchecked power, okay, then the asymmetry may manifest mostly idiosyncratic returns because these are harder to be observed by the labor unions, by the employees, by the public, whereas the systematic returns are easily observable. Okay, so thus we examine whether this asymmetry is related to corporate governance, and we rely on the exogenous shocks based on the state-level universal demand laws in the US. So the previous literature shows that after passage of these laws, actually the corporate governance in a firm will become worse because now shareholders will face a more difficult time in suing the managers and directors. And basically, this slide shows you that the asymmetry pattern we find is actually much more pronounced for firms with these UD laws. Okay, that is when the corporate governance is worse. And we also perform cross-sectional tests to see whether this asymmetry pattern is stronger when there is lack of external monitoring. And we find that the asymmetry is actually much stronger for firms with lower analyst coverage, and that is a proxy for the information environment of the firm. Like the firm is more opaque, like the public does not know much about firms. The asymmetry is stronger, and also for firms with lower union coverage or lower labor productivity, like the employees have lower monitoring, there's less labor monitoring of the firms, then you observe a stronger asymmetry. And we also discussed several alternative explanations. For example, whether the executives may face greater ex-ante turnover risk relative to the employees upon bad performance. So they will suffer less pay cut upon poor performance if they are not fired. Okay? So we explicitly examine this turnover explanation for our result. In fact, we do not find evidence consistent with this explanation because we find that when performance is worse, actually executives are less likely to have turnover relative to the employees when performance gets worse. Okay, so this seems to indicate that this ex-ante compensation for higher turnover risk is not likely to be a driving force for our result. And we also consider a bunch of other alternative explanations. How much time do I have? Oh, okay. Then probably I should just conclude. So basically, in this paper, we use granular data for a comprehensive set of US companies to examine within-firm pay inequality in the US. We offer a first look at the gap in pay growth along the corporate ladder, which by itself is an important dimension in pay inequality. And we also think that it is less sensitive to the executive-employee talent difference. We also document that managerial rent extraction is one plausible driving force that affects the profit sharing between shareholders, like the capital contributors, and also workers, the labor contributors of differential ranks. But we do not want to claim that rent extraction is the only explanation or is the most important explanation for this pay growth gap pattern that we observe. There might be many other rational or behavioral explanations for our results. But we want to open this useful dialogue for future research. And one last thing is our paper also has policy implication because our evidence provides partial support for the more stringent disclosure requirement for the US public companies to disclose more about their pay practices across the corporate hierarchy. Because we think that more public scrutiny may be useful in curbing the managerial rent extraction and managerial entrenchment that we see in the data. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now for the discussion, we have Mireia, Giné.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's my first in-person conference in a long, long time. I'm extremely excited. And thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this paper. This is... Let me see. Yes. So it's wonderful to discuss a paper that has a very big and important question. It sort of forces you to go back into the literature and see where is the debate, what have we learned, and where is this, where are the authors pushing this forward. And they take a finance outlook rather than an economic outlook. And what do I mean by a finance outlook? They want to build on these three views of what are the determinants of executive compensation. And we know that one important view is this optimal contracting view, these papers that have been highly cited so far that focus on how size increases the profitability of the firm and therefore makes managers more valuable as they increase the marginal product. As well, these models enhance the matching element, right? So it's about the complementarities of managers with the type of firm, including, and now that we have learned from Dirk's presentation, that we should enrich these models with asymmetric information and firm-specific skills. And then there's the second line here of research trying to examine what are the rent extraction factors. So compensation, in particular, determining whether the compensation is for non-performance. Are there any hidden pay elements? Are there pay practices that are related to poor governance? And finally, the third stream of literature focuses on institutional settings, changes in regulation for top executives. And I think that an interesting element as well is pay advisors' captures, right? How boards more and more are following this governance check and following what pay advisors recommend. And we've seen this move from cash to options, now to performance-based awards. So in this setting, this paper tries to look at these differential determinants by focusing on what they call the pay growth gap. And for that, they have a very rich database from the census. They match it with Capital IQ. So for once we are outside the executive comp universe, we have a much larger set of corporations and a very rich description of the employee base. And their interest is into examining the relationship between the pay growth gap and firm performance. And when they think about firm performance, they think, okay, let's take this model that allows me to differentiate between skills and luck, idiosyncratic risk versus systemic risk. What are the results? Let me just go very fast over them. So they find that higher pay growth for managers, there is indeed higher pay growth managers than employees, and the difference is between 16.5% versus 5%. And the growth gap, so the difference between these two growths, the gap is positively associated with both systematic and idiosyncratic returns. The second result, and this is the core of their paper, is trying to understand the asymmetry. And how do they estimate this asymmetry? Well, executives get rewarded for good idiosyncratic performance, but only weakly penalized when there is bad performance. And how strong is this asymmetry? One standard deviation increase in idiosyncratic returns is associated with an increase in the gap of 4.7%. And one standard deviation decrease in idiosyncratic return is associated with a decrease of the gap of 1.6%, okay? This gap is stronger for weaker governance, and they go through a bunch of robustness tests. And finally, as a result of all these robustness tests, they claim, or at least in the version that I've read of the paper, that it is mostly consistent with range extraction rather optimal contracting. Yeah? Okay, so my comments are not about really the execution of the paper, but more about how they've strategically thought about this question and what are we trying to learn from this rich data. And my first question to the authors is why pay growth gaps? And we know from the literature that there are concerns with level gaps, right? And my question would be to the authors, are these really concerns relaxed when we look at the growth gap? Yeah, this is sort of a second moment, and is this really the case? And I'm thinking here, these are some of the ongoing concerns. So if we have ongoing improvement in investment opportunities, then firms will have to attract and retain skilled managers, executive pay will rise, and naturally the gap will rise accordingly. Yeah, which is the same, would happen as well with level. Second concern, well, as firms change their corporate structure, if there is, and here I emphasize ongoing, if there is ongoing outsourcing of low-wage workers on ongoing automation, the change in the base of rank-and-file employees will naturally deliver you as well these changes in the average growth gap as well. And finally, another common concern with the level gaps is changes in pay performance sensitivities in the contract. High performance sensitivity leads to very high pay when performance is high, right? Well, this will be reflected as well in the growth gaps. Though I would consider that this is potentially, you will observe less changes throughout your time series, as contracts do not change that much during the tenure of a CEO. Which leads me to the next comment, which is about the asymmetry result that you find vis-a-vis contract design. And what is the contribution of contract design to this asymmetry? So we think about the type of contracts that we would like to observe for executives is to first avoid remuneration for lack, and secondly, for executives to exert effort and take on risk. So by design, my understanding is that there is an asymmetry in the exposure of risk. So these contracts, top executives will benefit from the positive outcomes, but will be insulated or have limited liability when you have bad outcomes. Yeah? And essentially as well, you can get fired. So that's as well part of that asymmetry. So my question to the authors is whether this contract design explains part of this asymmetry that you observe in the data. How does it map into growth gaps? It's a little bit less obvious. Which leads to another comment on the asymmetry and rent extraction hypothesis. And the first question would be, okay, how economically large is this asymmetry? Should we be concerned? Is this something meaningful economically? Yeah? And of course, you're talking about growth gaps. So if we look into levels, right? So the differential growth between the 90th percentile and the median employee, the differential growth is between 48 to 28%, or other papers have estimated between 10 and 20%. So I'd like to understand a bit more of the economic magnitudes that you actually observe. And in something that I would be very interested in is, rather than the cross-section, the time series. At the end of the day, companies and labor markets are changing, right? There is this rise in inequality. We've been discussing as well earlier today that the type of investments that companies do might not be fully captured in the balance sheet. Competition setup is changing. So how are these changes affecting the gap, right? Rather than having a cross-section with firm fixed effects. I personally would be much more interested in understanding what are the drivers of the gap. Which leads me to the third comment, which is you guys have a super rich database. Yeah? You have the full, or as close as we can get to the full distribution of employees. And you synthesize this information by taking the average of executives and the average of rank and file. And I think there's so much richness that you can possibly exploit here. And there are many interesting questions which we actually don't know, is how the hierarchy of the corporation is actually evolving, how is this mapped to compensation, and whether I would be very interested in understanding if the second tier of executives are already treated like rank and file employees. We just don't know when the corporation gets flatter. Yeah, so I would be very interested. As well, there are new papers that talk about how compensation practices get clustered. So we know that CEO compensation is less and less dispersed. That could be as well happening to the first tier of executives, second tier, and so forth, worth exploring. Talking more about heterogeneity, I think that as well you have a much larger sample of corporations, and it would be interesting to understand how is the distribution of this pay growth gap. Yeah? And is it driven by a handful of corporations? And here I would like to take the zoom out of, from finance into economics. And this paper that you have cited, Song et al., Firming Up Inequality, gives us a very macro view of what are the important drivers of inequality. And they cite these three factors. 2/3 can be explained by sorting of higher paid workers to higher paid corporations, okay, the sorting effect that we've talked about. There's as well a rise in segregation, meaning that the best workers, the best executives work with each other, okay? So we're going to observe as well more segregation within the same high paying firms. And third, there is a rise in inequality of firms. This is just 1/3 of the rise in inequality. But most of this rise in inequality is driven by a handful of firms that are the mega firms. Okay, so my question would be, what can we say about mega firms? Are your effects driven by these mega firms, or is it something that is generalized in your population? And another interesting insight from this paper is that when they look at the top 50 or top 5 employees, they only account for 3 to 1% of the increase in within firm inequality. Okay? Whereas if they look at the top 10% employees, of course, you have a much wider base of managers, technicians that are highly paid, and that can account for 46% of the rise within firm inequality. So again, just moving away just from looking at the top versus the bottom, but sort of understanding the distribution of employee compensation. And this leads me to my final comment, which is where is the debate? So we have these two main views of contracting and rent extraction. We would all agree here there is a combination of both theories that determine the final compensation of executives. So having more granular data with this long time series would give us a sense, at the end of the day, if you take the stand that these results are only explained or mostly explained by rent extraction, said, okay, what happens to the time series? Are we moving to what equilibrium are we moving? Are we moving to a more of a rent extraction equilibrium or to a more optimal contracting? And I think that this paper maybe reflect broadly what are the forces behind this inequality within firms. And the first element that we cannot dismiss, obviously, is the technological change and the rise of return to skills. And that forces firms to change the composition of their workers. So this is something that you could explore as well. Within firm inequality, right, we know that is bounded by outsourcing. So, we might be capturing the full effect of inequality because firms are just, pushing away their low-paying workers. And finally, this cumulative effect of winner takes most competition that we are observing as well out there that is pushing compensation. So just to summarize, these are my comments, and I hope that, the paper, when I think that the paper, can make a great contribution to this literature. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now, Jack, if you want to have a brief response, and then we'll take questions.
Thank you, Mireia, for an excellent discussion. And I think, most of I agree with your discussion on a lot of the issues. I think these are really good suggestions. I just want to respond very briefly. You mentioned 3 potential reasons for why the executives can enjoy pay growth relative to the employees, like investment opportunities and corporate structure change, like AI or something, right? Yeah, for this second explanation, you mentioned also there might be a change in the base or the composition of the employees, right? So that's something we're trying to address by fixing the pool of employees in our estimation. So so I think due to our granular nature of the data, we can actually fix the pool of the employees in the firm to measure this pay growth more accurately. And also you also raised one alternative explanation for this asymmetry. It could be that the firms are just encouraging their managers or CEOs to take more risk, right? So we separate our sample between those industries that need more risk encouragement, like those R&D intensive industries or high growth industries. And we do not find a difference between these high growth or high innovative industries versus other industries. So the asymmetry pattern seems to be very similar. So we think that, that can alleviate some of the concerns for this pattern is just to encourage risk-taking. And your other comments are just so good, like how to exploit more granularity in our data to look at employee heterogeneity and also look at the distribution of the pay growth gap. Yeah, all those points are well taken. Yeah.
Okay, we'll start with a question from Tom.
Thanks very much. I mean, just a couple of things I think you need to be really careful about in the analysis. So One is about how pay bands work within companies. So typically someone will get promoted into a role and they will move through a pay band. And at the senior levels of organisations, those pay bands are quite wide. So during someone's tenure, their pay growth could be quite fast as they move through the role. Whereas lower down in organisations, you'll get much more closer to there just being a rate for the job with very little within band progression. So under the methodology you've chosen with people who've been there for 5 years, even if there was no change in the pay distribution across the firm, you would expect to see a positive increase in the relative pay growth in the way that you've defined it, simply because of the way that pay bands work. So I just think you need to be quite careful about that. And the second issue to be careful about is just how you're dealing with performance-related pay and previously granted equity, and the role that that plays in the pay performance sensitivity. I think that maybe needs a little bit more discussion.
Okay, elaborate on the second one.
Yeah, so I mean, I wasn't 100% sure about I think the definition of pay you're using is the standard disclosed total compensation. So it's expected value of granted equity rather than realised value. Yes.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
whereas actually a lot of the, the way executive pay works is that most of the pay performance relationship comes through the difference between realised and expected value of equity grants, and in particular changes in the in the previously vested equity holdings of CEOs, which tend to dominate anything that happens around kind of year-on-year pay changes. So I think there probably needs to be some sort of recognition and discussion of how that might affect the way these dynamics play out.
Yeah, you can answer that one if you want.
Yeah,
or
so,
do you have a reaction?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, thanks, Dan. Yeah, for the equity-based compensation, yeah, you're right that we use the ground day value of the executive compensation. So that includes the stock option value at the ground day, not the exercise value. So, but we find that the asymmetry pattern we observe in pay growth gaps still persists if we just look at the cash pay of the executives or even the base pay of these executives. So if you just get rid of all those incentive components of the executive pay, we still observe a very similar pattern. And about the moving pay ranks within the firm, we fix the pool of executives and the employees when calculating the pay growth change. So I'm not sure how that will be affected by
Maybe want to pick up after.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Thanks. I was a little bit puzzled by the instrument that you were using with regard to the universal demand laws, because your data essentially documents that if anything, there's rent seeking between management and rank and file employees. I mean, why should I worry about that as a shareholder, right? So if it's not taking the dimension that they're really screwing the people up in a way that they are leaving the firm and stuff like that, I would not really necessarily be concerned, and therefore I was puzzled by the very strong results that this variable actually yielded. Because what's your intuition behind that? Why would I care as a shareholder so much?
Yeah, we think that this rent extraction, the managerial rent extraction we document here, probably has two components. One is the rent extraction, the executives' rent extraction from the employees. That's in your mind. And another source is the rent extraction from the shareholders as well. Because when the corporate governance is weaker, these managers have more power and they are more entrenched. So they probably have more say on setting their own pay. So that could potentially explain the result, why it is stronger when we have the universal demand laws. Yes, thanks.
Jeff?
Thanks. A couple of points. Following a little bit from what Tobias said about the governance variable, what about say on pay? I mean, the existence of a say on pay law and the way it's been used. Is this working? Yeah. The existence of a say on pay law, the addition of that, it seems to me would swamp any other governance measure as to the potential impact that the shareholders would have on the compensation structure of the firm. And to the extent that they cared about the variable that you've identified, presumably that would be involved in the discussions. And maybe that's been discussed, but not so very much. But it does seem you would have to take account of the advent of say on pay and the use of say on pay in any discussion of the governance variable as a measure of, as a thesis behind the rent extraction story. Secondly, and this is just at the level of anecdote, on the rent extraction story. Well, first, the point that was made by the discussion about the fact that the inequality is present in the non-NEO level, that is to say, the high paid but not decision-making executives, suggests against the rent extraction story, which is generally put in terms of the very top officers of the firm. But secondly, you see the phenomenon, I'm just, again, an anecdote, in the law firm world, where all of a sudden a fairly limited degree of inequality has exploded. This is in the US, in which the partners who are regarded as productive are all of a sudden making very large amounts of money, and within firm inequality has really ballooned. And I just don't think rent extraction could explain that. And I don't know if it's optimal contracting or not, but whatever the phenomenon is, I suspect that. I would think it might explain a little bit of what you're observing in the explosion of the pay level inequalities. And I mean, it's a deep concerning phenomenon, but I don't think the conventional ways that we've been, the typical approach in the literature may not get at what's going on here.
Thank you. Can I respond? Sure. Yeah, thanks for the suggestion on say on pay laws. I'm not an expert on it, but when does this say on pay law get into existence? Because it probably is. Your data set is until 2008. 2008, yeah. Our sample is a little bit old because of the census data restriction. We were only given data up to 2008, so that probably I cannot take advantage of that. But the second point is about the rent extraction might not be able to fully explain the pattern we see. We totally agree, yeah. So actually we find results both consistent with like a talent differential or the competitive sorting model and rent extraction. And as the discussant also suggested, that we probably want to think more about the relative magnitudes of these explanations. So we should think about how important our results can be explained by rent extraction versus other possible explanations. So that's something we need to think about. Yeah, but thanks. Yeah.
I want to push back on your policy implications. And in particular, I want to echo what Mireia said. You have amazing data. And the fact that you aggregate at the firm level, I think it's hiding all of these interesting interactions. So actually, I think the averages, like the reporting requirement data is probably pretty useless, right? And so I think your paper doesn't say anything about the usefulness of that kind of data. So if you can, I really think it's important to look at the disaggregated data. And I mean, there's many reasons. I mean, so first, the average tenure of an executive is about 7 years, right? It'd be interesting to look at the average tenure of an employee and say, what proportion of the pay growth is driven by the fact that you keep on replenishing the executive pool, right? So that's obviously important. And also, I think you need a bit of theory, right? I mean, if you're an employee who's always doing the same thing versus an executive who's constantly doing something different, what are our expectations about pay growth? I have no idea, right? So I think having more of a theoretical literature to sort of, guide the analysis, I think would be really important. And then finally, since you're using these universal demand laws, in the US, there was also a period when non-shareholder constituency laws were passed, which essentially gave more power to employees. At least, people say it gave more power to employees. The lawyers disagree, but may be interesting to look at those laws because I think they might fall into your time period.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, this is a great suggestion. Yeah, we will look at non-shareholder constituency laws. Okay.
Jennifer, Holger, and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, look, thanks. That was really interesting. I've got three short points. The first one was, my recollection is that the pay ratio rule, before its implementation by the SEC, came in the Dodd-Frank Act at the same time as Say on Pay. So, and it snuck in right at the end and really surprised people, this pay ratio point. Mireia made the point about the importance of outsourcing, the fact that what you're looking at may not capture the whole universe of the lower paid workers. And I may have misunderstood Mireia, but I got the sense that she was saying that this is sort of a natural development. But I know at the time when this pay ratio rule came in, people predicted that companies would game the system by moving their employees or their lowest paid employees off onto contracts so that they were not captured by this pay ratio rules. And I just wonder, you know, I have no idea whether anyone's investigated when these rules came in, whether there was a big shift in the, you know, the ratio between employees and independent contractors in some of the largest firms. But that would be interesting to know whether it was a deliberate runaround. And then just Tobias's point about, well, why would shareholders care about pay gaps of this kind? It made me think back to 2017 when BlackRock wrote to the top 300 CEOs in the UK and said, we're not going to approve any of your CEO pay increases unless there's a commensurate increase in pay for employees. So it's sort of interesting that BlackRock would play so hardball in the UK context, whereas you're sort of seeing this big gap opening up in the US. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, why shareholders care? There is a forthcoming JF paper showing, just using the recent data of this disclosure of CEO to median employee pay data. They using 2 years of data, they find that the stock market actually reacts negatively if the company discloses higher CEO to median employee pay. So it seems that the shareholders do care, whether this is due to like a growing concern over the ESG or the fair treatment of the employees, or due to some other concerns over like managerial power or entrenchment. I think that would be another interesting question to look at. Yeah.
Two narrow comments and then a broader comment. The narrow comments are about the universal demand laws. I don't think any of the lawyers believe that this thing works as a identification for any of these sorts of effects. And the reason is simply that there are no derivative lawsuits challenging executive pay. I mean, maybe there have been one or two, whatever, you know, we'll probably find one, but this is not the constraint on executive pay. Econometrically, there's a lot of issues with using universal demand laws. I know of a paper that's going to come out. I don't know if it's already out. I'm not going to say if you don't know it. That's going to dig very deeply into the data that purport to show an effect of these things, and it's going to show that actually there is no effect of these things, as you would expect, just given the institutional knowledge. I myself have a paper on the econometrics of these panel data studies with clustered data. State clustering does not work, gives you vast over-rejection. So you should use a better statistical test for this. I would suggest mine, which is permutation test. But in any event, you know, one thing is for sure, there is huge issues with this stuff. So now to my bigger comment, this was very critical, but I like Mireia said, I think you have fantastic data. And I think you're not really fully exploiting the power of these data yet. The underlying concern is that when you look at the cross-sectional data, there's all these compositional effects and blah, blah, blah. You have here the full universe of these workers, so you can really trace out what happens to the workforce. You know, do these compositional shifts happen? Is that an explanation for why we see the difference in the median salaries, blah, blah, blah. Not so much focusing on this headline number of the growth number. You know, if you know that we have a big gap now and we didn't have a big gap in the past, clearly there must have been differential growth. We can just back it out. So, you know, what you can do though with your data is you can be much more granular and show like the composition shifts and so on. So I would exploit that. I would back up Mireia's comment on this.
So composition, you mean more about the look at the future career path of the employees, something related?
You have the full thing, yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
It's on, yeah. Thanks so much for the paper. It's really quite interesting. And I had a similar comment as Holger on the universal demand. As a corporate law scholar, I was a little puzzled about the use of that in this particular context. And I also had another question for you, which is putting together the discussion we just had from Dirk's great presentation on the market for CEOs. I wonder if you think there's any insights to be gleaned by, in a sense, putting the papers together that perhaps, and also the conversation we've just had about the limits of the rent extraction explanation and the need for more theory, that perhaps there's also something going on about it, and maybe part of it is historical and changing, but about the internal market of creation of executives that creates the pool that eventually might become somebody tapped for higher positions. And that's useful to the firm, especially if almost 90% or so of CEOs come from inside or people that are highly known. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, we also would like to find a theoretical paper that can guide our empirical test. So far, we haven't. In this sense, our paper actually tells the same message as Dirk's paper. Like we just review some interesting patterns in the data, and probably we call for more theory development, like to better get guidance. For future. Yes.
Dirk.
I've thought a lot about this sort of rent extraction versus non-rent extraction stuff, and sort of it's extremely difficult. Because at the end of the day, there's obviously still a market out there, right? So even if you have, say, we know that over the last 20 years, publicly traded companies made a lot more money, right? Even after pay. So it's perfectly reasonable to think that in a lot of these companies, the highest paid executives grabbed some of that additional surplus that was being created. But now everybody else is still competing with those companies in some kind of market for executive talent. Right? Yes, I argued earlier that sort of at the top, very, very top level, that market probably doesn't work very well. But I think we all believe that a couple layers down, that market actually is really quite active. So now all the other firms will have to also increase their pay. Right? So now we're trying to figure out, is there rent extraction or not? Well, at the end of the day, I mean, go away from top executives, right? If Google is paying $500,000 for a mid-level programmer, that's going to affect everybody else who's trying to hire in the same market. So you're then going to see wages for those kind of programmers rise, that are in that pool, rise across the board. And now you're trying to, by comparing across firms, you're trying to figure out whether there's rent extraction or not. That is extraordinarily difficult. I don't have an answer. I'm sort of just kind of describing, I think, the problems that we as empirical researchers are facing, trying to figure out whether there's rent extraction or not, by comparing stuff across companies. We need to keep in mind they're actually hiring from the same labor market, right? So that's, in the end, it's easy to write on a model in which everybody's going to pay the same, yet there's still massive rent extraction going on in a subset of companies, which then affects everybody else.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
So I think we've all earned our lunch, and it just leaves me to thank Jack and Mireia for a terrific paper and wonderful discussion. Thank you very much.